Vivekananda is traveling in India. He asked me to take for the next 2 Friday nights the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Our main text for this will be the Raja Yoga, Conquering the Internal Nature by Swami Vivekananda. So let us begin tonight's talk with repeating the way Swami Vivekananda opens that book by repeating the words will be shown there. Each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal. Do this either by work or worship or psychic control or philosophy, by one or more or all of these, and be free. This is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas, rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. He also uses that same verse in his commentary to chapter 2, verse 25. So, now you can switch over to my, oh, do I have it? Okay. All right. So I thought we would begin actually by reciting one more verse together, and this is the way Swami Vivekananda closes his book. It's his last commentary to the Patanjali Yoga Sutra number 33, which is in chapter 4 of the Yoga Sutras. Now, chapter 4 of the Patanjali Sutras is titled Kaivalya Pada, which is really the description of independence. This is after going through the first 3 chapters when this person finally achieves the independence, the freedom. This is what they experience there. So it's the story of the transcended ego. Now in some editions, there is one additional verse to the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, but Swami Vivekananda concludes his book with verse 33 and the following commentary. So you can either listen or read along as you prefer. And thus, through pleasure and pain, through good and evil, the infinite river of souls is flowing into the ocean of perfection, of self-realization. Our sweet nurse nature forever is taking self-forgetting souls by the hand and bringing them higher and higher until their lost glory comes back. Glory unto those who have realized the self. May their blessings be on us all. And so this description is the final and culminating experience and the goal of those who follow this Raja Yoga path. So why start this 2-night series at the very end? Well, it's actually a common technique in literature and movies to show a glimpse near the very end of the movie, near the final. And then they revert to the very beginning and then tell the whole story, and then that final version, that final scene reappears one more time in its full context. So that's the approach I've taken here, kind of setting up the ending of the Yoga Sutras, but now we have to begin all the way back at the beginning. So the outline for tonight is, or for the next 2 sessions actually, is to cover the first 6 aphorisms of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. That's what Swamiji requested. And it follows pages 107 through 121 in the Raja Yoga book here. In the paperback, the numbers might be different in the hard copy version if you have a hardcover version. And as we go, I want to provide ties to the Tuesday and Friday sessions as frequently as I can and wherever possible to show that the next 2 nights are not just plug-in, fill-in, but they actually have context and ties related to the ongoing Tuesday and Friday classes. So I'll make references to those classes as well. The 4 main references for tonight are the Raja Yoga by Swami Vivekananda, Meditation and Spiritual Life by Swami Yatishwarananda, which is a book I rely quite a bit on. And then Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play, which is the Tuesday text, and that's the Swami Chetananda translation. And the Svetashvatara Upanishad, which we use as the Friday night text. So those are all the ingredients I'm mixing in for the next 2 Fridays, and probably a lot more too. So it'll be quite a roller coaster ride, as my talks usually are, but hopefully it'll be fun and entertaining. So I want to start now with an excerpt from Swami Yatishwarananda's Meditation in Spiritual Life. It says there, "On the way up, the world and its beings progressively lose their reality and ultimately disappear. But on the way down, sages see all of these permeated through and through with the Supreme Spirit. That which was realized intuitively as Brahman by the process of neti-neti is then found to have become the universe and all living beings." Now that one verse is a lot to really unpack from there. First is the idea of two directions, up and down, motion in two directions. And if not motion in a physical sense, certainly some change or some shift in one's consciousness can be inferred. And that's our first tie actually to the Tuesday classes, because there was a session a few weeks back where Swami Yogatmananda was explaining how Sri Ramakrishna said to his devotees, "I'm going to explain to you all of the changes in my consciousness as I go from level to level," and he set out to do that. The only problem was, once he got beyond what they call level 5, the throat chakra, he lost his ability to speak to the devotees. And he tried this several times and had the same result every time. But something is changing. Clearly, Swami Yatishwarananda wouldn't have picked two words, for two different words, if they didn't have any relevance. And so up and down is always relative, related to something, right? So when we point to the zenith point in the sky and say we're looking up, it's usually with reference to a gravitationally established line. That means if we put on a string some weight, that establishes the down. Once we establish the down, we know the up. So they're always related, the up and down, related to a different reference point. And there are actually different ups for different people on the earth, depending on where you live on the earth. So at the North Pole, the star that is directly overhead, we call it the North Star, it's also known as Polaris, is directly overhead. But if you live on the equator, that same North Star barely makes it above the horizon, because it's equal to the latitude at which you live determines how high up that star is. So up and down in this Swami Yatishwarananda quote has to be related to some change of state of something, and it's consciousness. And we heard that in the Tuesday night classes as well. Also in the quote was a suggestion or a technique or a method called neti-neti, which is the Sanskrit contraction for not this, not this. And this is the process by which somebody asks at every turn, every moment, every instant, is this the ultimate reality? No, not this. Is this the ultimate reality? No, not this. And so you proceed on neti-neti, first to the physical objects, this microphone, this podium stand, this light. Reject all of that. That's certainly not this. Then what about your thoughts and your emotions? You reject those. This can't be it. This can't be it. And eventually you keep rejecting everything that is an object, everything that appears in your awareness as not this, until finally, eventually, a state of perfectly still, objectless consciousness alone remains. And so think back now to the concluding verse from the Raja Yoga that we saw on the opening slide. The infinite river of souls is flowing into the ocean of perfection of self-realization. Our sweet nurse nature forever is for taking self-forgetting souls by the hand, bringing them higher and higher until their lost glory comes back. And so the person that has made this journey from this duality to this state of oneness and then back is called a Vijnani by Sri Ramakrishna. And that individual recognizes both the transcendent nature and the immanent nature as both being part of Brahman. And we see this as well with the Totapuri, who taught Sri Ramakrishna the Advaita, saying meditate here, until Sri Ramakrishna finally realized it. But Totapuri did not want to recognize the immanent aspect. And then Sri Ramakrishna finally convinced him that both the transcendent and the immanent are both manifestations of the Brahman. And this is perhaps where verse 34 of the Yoga Sutras, which is not in Swami Vivekananda's version, might fit in, because it translates as follows. Kaivalya, the state of enlightenment, follows the re-emergence of the Gunas because of their becoming devoid of the object of the Purusha. So this was kind of interesting, and I spent some time with the Sanskrit words. But basically, my interpretation of it is the Gunas re-emerge, they reappear, but now they're devoid of the Purusha. So the person who was once coupled in to this play, this Leela, has now realized that it is a play. And so the Gunas, the activity, this immanent form of Brahman, is interpreted by this person that has gone all the way to the transcendent and then back as just that, as just a play. And they can see it from that perspective. And so independence, which is the last chapter of the sutras, freedom is when the aims of the Purusha are free from the influences of material nature. The spirit of the person is freed from physical and psychological conditioning. Thus the spirit is established in its own natural state and responds freely to life as it happens. So on this next slide, it's titled Nowhere, Now Here, and Nowhere. And the idea is we come from nowhere, we are now here, and we are going nowhere. And actually, this clever phrase, I first heard this in a talk by the author and self-development lecturer, Dr. Wayne Dyer. And I'm not sure if he was the originator or if he was also borrowing it. But I'm borrowing it from him because that's where I heard it. But it's interesting. And the slide also shows another quote from Swami Raja Yoga. It says, the consensus of the great minds of the world is that we come out of an absolute condition into a present relative condition and are going forward to return to that absolute. So this being granted, Swamiji asks, which is better, the absolute or this state? And so we can ask also many questions about this. Is Wayne Dyer's nowhere the same as Swami Vivekananda's absolute? Was the first question that came to my mind. Well, Vedanta says that the absolute transcends space and time. So in a way, the absolute cannot be said to be found anywhere. If it is not anywhere, then perhaps we can say it is nowhere, and perhaps we can equate the two ideas. But we can also ask, is this coming out and going back real? Or is the whole of it, as Advaita Vedanta claims, a superimposition onto a pure consciousness? For example, the snake is never really in the rope. So the snake can really have never said to have come or gone because it was a superimposition of something that never existed in the first place. So hopefully that makes sense. And then there are other subtle philosophical implications embedded in this claim as well. It would seem that to imply that coming from the absolute or the all other, the not I, would completely determine the I, in the same way that a single piece removed from a child's picture puzzle, perhaps you remember those as a kid, it's a picture stamped on a bunch of randomly shaped cardboard pieces and you put them all together and it finally makes a picture. Well, if you take out one of those picture puzzle pieces, it's uniquely defined by all of the rest. It can only fit in one space. And all of the colors and shape and other things that are on it also have to match everything else on its borders, otherwise you wouldn't have a contiguous whole, right? You'd have some discontinuity. So if I have half of a pink flower here, and the piece that was taken out was adjoining the pink flower, I can't stick it back in with a half of a purple flower there without a major discontinuity in the picture, right? So the wholes sometimes can be said to divine the individual in order to complete the whole in a coherent way that makes sense. It also further suggests that the entire creation both its temporal and spatial unfoldment, is really determined at one instant, at the moment of the superimposition of the first form on the pure consciousness. So if we see ourselves as separate from the reality, really we are part of the whole, because we cannot be other than what we are, even in the most limited psychophysical sense, if you think about it. The snake had to be where it was because the rope was there. And it had to take the shape that it did because that was the shape of the rope. And that was the time and the place of the rope. The bottom third of the screen here depicts stages 4 through 11 of the stages of spiritual unfoldment as they appear in the book Meditation and Spiritual Life by Swami Yatishwarananda. I've used these before, but they're very helpful. And they relate very intimately, actually, with the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, as we will see when we start stepping through them. But stages 4 through 7 describe the process of merging back into the Absolute from our present relative condition, as was written in the quote from Swami Vivekananda. So the ego, which is our demarcating line separating the soul from the whole, is represented by that solid dot in the center. And this solid dot becomes less and less real as it progresses towards stage 7, at which point it has completely merged back into the Absolute. And this concept is actually one of the guided meditations that Swami Yogatmananda uses here, sometimes on the Saturday programs, during which we visualize the true self encased in a block of ice, which is slowly dissolving in a pot of water. And slowly, slowly, the block dissolves until finally the soul merges into the water. That's one visualization. Another one is the salt doll example, which we heard from Sri Ramakrishna. If you have a doll that is made of salt, pure salt, and it was aware and it was conscious, and it said, "Let me go measure how deep the ocean is." So this salt doll walks into the ocean and starts to go down to try to get to the bottom to measure how deep the ocean is. It eventually gets dissolved on the way down and becomes one with the ocean. And this idea of dissolving salt and water also appears in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika in chapter 4, verse 5. And stage 7 in the image there represents this complete merging. It is the highest experience claimed by the non-dual school of Vedanta. And from this experience, it is said that most people do not or cannot return. So to put it in a dualistic sense, seeing God face to face, or as the yogis put it, the energy of experiencing the non-dual is so strong that the body cannot handle it and gets destroyed the same way we would burn up a wire when too much electrical current is passed through it if it's not protected with a fuse. Psychologically, you can think of it as with no desires left at all, there is no need to retain a body or mind complex, which was created by us solely for the purpose of trying to extract enjoyment from this world and from this play of dualities. Now the good news is that nature has provided us with a built-in fuse. However, certain yoga practices are said to allow one to bypass this fuse. And the beings which are destined to be spiritual leaders and spiritual teachers of humankind actually can bypass this natural circuit breaker and attain to this absolute state and still return from it. And then they spend the rest of their lives in the states of consciousness 9, 10, and 11, which is either the pure Advaitic state or the state where you see beings all as related to the divine play. And that's how they spend their time. There's a lot of evidence that many cultures and ancient people knew of such practices. The medicine men of the King Bushmen of Africa have a very specific fire dance that they do, and the elders are given a specific number of steps to perform, and they have to step a certain way, and they go round and round the fire until they go into a transcendent state. Some of the shaman, like of Nepal, they have a certain drumming ceremony followed by certain Buddhist know if they call them asanas or not, but certain practices. And the rhythm of the drumming and the practices also induce in these medicine people this transcendent state, which allows them to bring healing energies back to their people. And so, I had already talked about in the Tuesday class a few weeks ago, Sri Ramakrishna was making it his attempt to discuss his changes in consciousness. And he was giving some basic descriptions. The energy rises up from the feet, coming up, until he got to a certain point about here, and then he couldn't speak about it any longer. He went into a nonverbal state, and his devotees were getting frustrated. Come on, you promised to tell us. And every time he got to that state, he said, Divine Mother has just stolen my voice at that point. He became so inwardly drawn. So far, this has provided some motivational background for our topic on the sutras, and some ties to the Tuesday class, which I wanted to bring. But let's now return to the question originally posed by Swami Vivekananda. So the consensus of the great minds of the world is that we are the outcome of some absolute condition into this present relative condition, and we're going to return to that absolute condition. So this being granted, which is better, the absolute or this state, is the next question he asks. And so before providing his answer, Swami Vivekananda's answer, he explored the answers that were put forth by others. And this is all coming now from the introduction section of his book, which just precedes the Yoga Sutras. So it starts on page 107 in the paperback version. And so now I'm going to take this quote directly out of that section. And so these are the words of Swami Vivekananda as he wrote them in the Raja Yoga introductory section before the sutras. Quote, there are not wanting people who think that this manifested state is the highest state of man. Thinkers of great caliber are of the opinion that we are manifestations of undifferentiated being, and the differentiated state is higher than the absolute. They imagine that in the absolute there cannot be any quality, that it must be insensate, dull, lifeless, that only this life can be enjoyed, and therefore we must cling to it. First of all, we want to inquire into the other solutions of life. So he's looking now at some of the solutions that have been proposed by others. He says there was an old solution that man after death remained the same, that all of his good sides, minus all of the evil sides, remained forever. Logically stated, this means man's goal was the world, this world, carried a stage higher and eliminated of its evils. It is the state they call heaven. This theory on the face of it cannot be. There cannot be good without evil, nor evil without good. To live in a world where all is good and no evil is what Sanskrit logicians call a dream in the air. Another theory in modern times, this is still Swami Vivekananda, has been presented by several schools that man's destiny, or humankind's destiny, is to go on always improving, always struggling towards, but never reaching the goal. And then he says, this statement, though apparently very nice, is also absurd because there is no such thing as motion in a straight line. Every motion is motion in a circle. So now I'm ending the Swami Vivekananda quote, and I will take you through a little bit of my musings and kind of some things that came to mind after I had read that. And so I wanted to examine this idea that every motion is motion in a circle and there's no motion in a straight line. So physicists study the shape of the universe and they create various mathematical models to describe it. And we're going to just take a real cursory look at some of the current models. Okay, on the left part of the picture is a picture actually from Isaac Newton's philosophy of the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And Newton proposed, he said, if I take some object like a cannonball or a rock, and I throw it not up, but tangential to the surface of the earth, right here. If I just throw it like this, parallel to the surface of the earth, and nothing was to impede it, let's pretend there are no walls and there are no buildings, eventually, if I throw it fast enough, it should come back around and gunk me in the head from behind. Okay, and that's Isaac Newton's proposal. And it actually is the basis of how satellites in orbit work. You shoot them up first vertically, but then you bend them over to a tangential, you shoot to a certain velocity, and then they continue to orbit the Earth using that principle. So that is truly motion in a circle. We know that it needs to be adjusted from time to time because there's some minor things that we don't need to get into here. On the right side of the picture is what is called a free return trajectory, and this was used in the Apollo program. And it's motion in a figure eight. It's not motion in a circle per se, but what it was designed to do was once you shoot these guys out of the main gravitational pull of the Earth, and they start to enter the lunar sphere, the moon will begin to curve that trajectory and leave what looks like a figure eight trajectory. That's designed to slingshot them back towards the Earth in the event of a major equipment failure. You're using the gravitational adjustment by the moon to bring them back. Now, it's not motion in a circle. It's motion in a figure eight or a quasi-figure eight figure. And actually, Apollo 13, the interesting fact was actually because of the major equipment failure, they did take advantage of that free return turn to bring Apollo 13 back. And this is a little bit of aside from the sutras, but it is part of the analysis of this idea of motion in a circle. But we can do more. We can say, well, there are speeds which we can impart to objects which will put objects out of the solar system. And this is called hyperbolic excess velocity. And such a velocity was imparted to the ship called Voyager 1, which was said to have left our solar system in August 2012 on what our scientists would say is a one-way trip out of the solar system. And certain comets and other things also make one pass through our region of the solar system, never to return. And they also have that hyperbolic excess velocity. So now I got to come back to Swami Vivekananda's question, and will these ever return? And so to further explain, or further explore at least, this idea of whether they will return, as Swami Vivekananda says, we have to look at the shape of the universe. And scientists have come up with different models for the universe, different mathematical models. So if you look on the left figure, the two-dimensional graph, on the vertical axis, what is shown there is the distance and separation of the galaxies. And on the bottom is time. So I know it's probably a little bit hard to read from there, but you just need to look at the shapes, not the numbers. The one that goes up and over and back down again says the galaxies separate to a maximum, and then they close, and they come back to zero separation. And they call this the Big Crunch. This is where the Big Bang sent everything out, everything goes out, then comes back in and crunches together. So that would at least be consistent with Swami Vivekananda. So no matter how far we send a satellite out of our solar system, eventually because of the Big Crunch, it goes out, and comes back to the origin. Okay, so that's one that would agree with Swami Vivekananda. The next one are the ones on the upper left, and that gives rise to not the spherical shape, but this thing that looks like a horse's or like a horse riding saddle. And if that's true, the end of the universe ends up is either what they call the Big Freeze or the Big Rip. So the Big Freeze is that everything goes on expanding. It never has enough to come back. So it goes on expanding, but it's cooling as it goes. Eventually, it just keeps going, but it gets so cold that nothing can exist, and they call that the Big Freeze. The Big Rip is a little bit more complicated, that even though it keeps going out and out and out and out, there's something called dark matter, dark energy, that it causes that to accelerate, and it just eventually shreds everything. Just rips the whole thing apart as it continues to expand. And lastly is the one which is the flat one. It's called the Euclidean geometry. And that just says basically the universe is flat and everything will keep on going. And ultimately the death of the universe, the fate of the universe from this flat model is the same as the open universe, which is the big freeze. It's the one in the middle. Okay. So the current measurements at least indicate that it's actually this flat version, which is probably the closest thing right now that the physicists say is true. So it would seem to imply that the Big Bang or the Big Crunch is not in the future. So how do we reconcile that with what Swami Vivekananda was talking about? Okay. So, well, from a Vedantic standpoint, all of this preceding analysis was a bit of a setup, actually. Because Vedanta will say everything is consciousness anyway, and everything that you just did as an amount of analysis is you're doing analysis on the snake. The snake doesn't exist, so you can make up all of the rules to explain the behavior of the snake, how it moves, how it twists, what color it is, but in reality it's a superimposition on the pure consciousness, so you're just playing a game within the game, and we don't really care. So Vedanta says, well, it's all consciousness, and any attempt to manipulate it or anything is just part of the duality which we need to get out of. Okay, so now let's look at what Swami Vivekananda actually wrote. So that was some of my musings. And let's look at what he actually wrote. He said, if you can take up a stone and project it into space and live long enough, that stone, if it meets with no obstruction, will come back exactly to your hand. All right, that's the Newtonian idea, which I had talked about. A straight line infinitely projected must end in a circle. Therefore, this idea that the destiny of humankind is progressing ever forward and never stopping is absurd. So he is saying that it's closer to that sphere, things always come back. But then he went on to comment indifferently. He said, although extraneous to his subject, his being Swami Vivekananda now, this idea explains the ethical theory that you must not hate, you must always love. Because just as in the case of electricity, the modern theory is that the power leaves the dynamo and comes back to the circle, completes the circle back to the generator basically. So with hate and love, they must come back to the source. Therefore, do not hate anybody, because that hatred which comes out of you must in the long run come back to you. If you love, that love will come back to you, completing the circle. It can be as certain as it can be that every bit of hate that goes out of the heart of a person comes back in full force. Nothing can stop it. Similarly, every impulse of love also comes back. On other and practical grounds, we see that the theory of internal progression is not untenable, for the destruction is the goal of everything earthly. All of our struggles and hopes and fears and joys, what will they lead to? They shall all end in death. Nothing is so certain as this. This is back to Swami Vivekananda's quotes, if I didn't explain it. Then where is this motion in a straight line? This infinite progression? It is only going out a certain distance and coming back to the center from which it started. And that's the end of Swami Vivekananda's quotes. Okay. So next he goes on to explain the way out. The first thing he mentions is that we must dissolve to become one with God. And the example he uses is that the seed, in order to become the tree, you put it in the ground, it literally actually has to rot. The shell has to come off, and then the little tree potential inside then can throw out a single little root, 2 leaves, and then 2 leaves, and then it grows its branches. So that seed must dissolve to become the tree. And then he asks, well, what proof is there that the absolute is higher than our relative state? He says, first we have the testimony of the great movers of the world who claim to have experienced it. They were not using their experiences to sell books, fame, or fortune, or make money, but they returned from such an experience to help and serve others and get others out of bondage, the bondage of misery. And then he says, philosophically, it's the only acceptable solution because of the misery and suffering of this relative state. There can be no other goal but to go beyond it. And now I'll quote directly from him, Swami Vivekananda. It follows that the sooner we get out of this state we call human, the better for us. Is it by committing suicide that we get out of this state? Not at all. That will be making it worse. Torturing ourselves or condemning the world is not the way to get out. We have to pass through the slough of despond, and the sooner we are through, the better. It must always be remembered that the human state is not the highest. Okay, so now I want to revisit this idea of the person that has gone and come back, the Vijnani. On the way up, the world and its beings progressively lose their reality and ultimately disappear. But on the way down, the sages see all of these, everything that they see, permeated through and through with the Supreme Spirit. Now, our detour into the orbits and the shape of the universe aside, we still have some unanswered questions about this particular verse. What does Swami Yatishwarananda mean when he says on the way up or on the way down or lose their reality? So now I'll give some more of my musings. And we look at many stories from many traditions and cultures which talk about saints and sages and prophets going up a mountain. Moses was said to receive his initial communication with God in a vision of a burning bush on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, during which that communication imparted to him his mission. So he went from an exiled son of a pharaoh to become a teacher and leader, and this is consistent with the whole message of those that go beyond and come back, become the leaders, the spiritual leaders and teachers of humankind. And the etymology of the words is kind of interesting, as best as I could find. Horeb, Mount Horeb, is thought to mean a glowing heat, which they say was reference to the sun. And Sinai, they think, was derived from the Sumerian deity of the moon, Sin. And so this idea of Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb would be the mountains of the moon and sun, respectively. And if you look at some of the pictures of yogis in the astral and where they show the nadis and everything, oftentimes they are depicted with the sun and the moon adjacent to their head as well. So I think going up the mountain, although it could physically happen, I mean, there's nothing that prevents a saint and sage from actually meditating up on a mountain, but it could also symbolically be the raising of this one's consciousness. We have many other stories and archetypes as well along this line, such as the wise person that lives high on a mountain. Again, we know if you go to Arunachala, you could find the wise person sitting there, as you know, on the mountain. But it also, again, can be symbolic of this raising of consciousness. It says that Jesus went up the mountain to avoid a crowd, and then later he meditated in a desert for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, here, going up the mountain into the desert can be symbolic of withdrawing one's consciousness internally to receive the experience of oneness. So what does the phrase Swami Yatishwarananda used, but on the way down, sages see all of the world and its beings permeated through and through with the Supreme Spirit. So this is, I had covered this a little bit earlier, where it seems that the sage which comes down from there experiences it and knows now everything is made of pure consciousness. And everything is permeated with this consciousness. So we see the self, the same self, in all of the beings. So I've covered a lot of different ideas now, and it's been pretty heavy going so far. So the next slide I'm going to show, we'll do a joke first, just to lighten the mood a little bit and give you some cooling to your brain cells here. So I'm going to ask, what color is a zebra? Is a zebra a white animal with black stripes or a black animal with white stripes? You can think about it for a minute. Okay, so actually the answer is neither. Zebras are invisible, We paint them black and white in order to see them. Okay? You think about it, it's kind of funny. So try to anticipate where this is going then. I'm going to ask, well, what color is Brahman? So what color is pure consciousness?
Orange.
Orange, well, there you go. See, I put the answer out in advance, orange. So again, the idea here being, or where this is kind of leading to, is that the transcendent is neither good or bad, or neither good or evil. It's non-dual. We see good and bad. It's our coloring as part of the immanent play. But the enlightened being is the one who has gone beyond that and realizes that this good or evil is just a play, right? So the pure consciousness, we can't say has any color at all. And so independence, freedom, is, again, the aim of the Purusha when it is free from the influences of material nature. The person is freed from conditional psychology, and the spirit is established in its own natural state and can respond to life as it happens. And that's how we see those who return from this play this game of life, while always taking refuge in understanding that the only reality is Brahman. They are free to play, and play the game seriously and hard in some sense, that if you look at how hard a saint and sage works for the benefit of others, I mean, you could easily say, well, if you know it's all a play, why not just remain in your own state of bliss and the heck with everything else? But they work very hard in the service of others. So even though they know it's the play, they are working hard and taking any and all roles needed to take each person hand by hand and to show that person that same ultimate state. And I found an interesting quote from Swami Chinmayananda. It's kind of a joke that he made about a devotee. He said a devotee came to me one time and said, "Oh, Maharaj, you know, you're such a wise person, and I see that you have 2 horns sticking out of your head. And can I do some service to you and polish your horns?" And he said, "Well, now I know I don't have any horns, but who am I to deny that devotee the pleasure of polishing my horns?" So he plays the game, and he allows the devotee. Now, of course, horns, you know, he's taking it to the extreme here by saying horns, but the idea was that devotees come to these great teachers with all kinds of notions and thoughts and things, and all of the teachers are put on the spot to answer these innumerable, endless questions. Sometimes over and over again, the same question appears by different people, and the saints and sages, just with a lot of patience and kindness and empathy, answer these questions for all of the people. And so I thought that was kind of nice. So the teacher continues this for the benefit of those who are still in the game. And there's a little bit more detail on page 267 here that Swami Vivekananda wrote. I excerpted part of it for the opening slide, but now I just want to revisit this idea in its full context. So he says, "Nature's task is done. This unselfish task which our sweet nurse Nature had imposed upon herself. She gently took the self-forgetting soul by the hand, as it were, and showed that person all of the experiences in the universe, all manifestations, bringing that person higher and higher through various bodies till the lost glory came back and the person remembered their own nature. Then the kind mother went back the same way she came for others who have lost their way in the trackless desert of life. And thus she is working without beginning and without end, and thus through pleasure and pain, through good and evil, the infinite river of souls is flowing into the ocean of perfection, of self-realization." So we have this idea that the people that attain to this highest state, come back and fulfill the role of this nurse, of this Divine Mother, by helping individuals that come their way also to find their way out. So, since we all have come out of that infinite existence, imprinted in our soul, we are all made in the image of God, or in other words, this idea of oneness is so imprinted in us so deeply, it really is the one idea around which all of activity in the universe turns. It's a search for reunion or making us one with all. We love some things or someone. We all want to establish harmony with at least some things or with some ones. And really, this is the play of life with all of its high and low points, its opposites, its conflicts, resolutions, and it continues on over and over again. The experience and testimony of the sages is of this oneness, and it is on the ground which they lay claim to universal love, altruism, compassion, justice, and equity. And it's really the only ground in which these can stand unshaken. And so in Raja Yoga, Swami Vivekananda writes that Raja Yoga is the science of religion, and it teaches us how to get these experiences. The teachers of the science of yoga therefore declare that religion is not only based upon the experience of ancient times, but that no one can be religious until they have that same perception. And yoga is the science which teaches us how to get these perceptions. It is not much use to talk about religion until one has felt it. Why is there so much disturbance, so much fighting, and so much quarreling in the name of God? There has been more bloodshed in the name of God than for any other cause, because people never went to the fountainhead. And the science of Raja Yoga in the first place proposes us to give us the means of observing our internal states. The instrument is the mind itself. The power of attention, when properly guided and turned towards the internal world, turned inward, the journey up the mountain, if you will analyze the mind and illuminate facts for us. The powers of the mind are like rays of light dissipated. When they get concentrated, they illumine. This is our only means of knowledge. So we come now to the Yoga Sutras, and we're going to just take up, we're just about out of time, so we'll just take up the very first verse tonight and the remaining verses next time. So the translation of the first verse is, now concentration is explained. And probably after all I've taken you through to get here, you're probably saying, now is about the right time, right? So I just want to explain a little bit about this. So what is a sutra in the first place? A sutra, and I remember it by the English word sutra, which is used to stitch, right? And it's a thread. So a sutra is a thread, and we string along these gems of wisdom for the teachers. So they're very short. The aphorisms are very short, just a few words strung together, sufficient to communicate the idea to the students. And so it's very short, and normally each sutra takes a lot of elaboration by the person doing the explaining. So that's the idea. Next time we'll pick up with this. Now concentration is explained. And the first question we'll answer next time is, if these are so efficient and they're so packed, no words can be needlessly added to them. Every word has an importance. So why now? Why is that included in the very first sutra? Obviously something is implied there or something is meant there. So we will take that up next time. So I think that concludes our program for tonight. If there are any discussion points that people would like to bring up or questions, we can do that. If not, we can proceed to the closing prayer. Yes, Charlie?
Neti seems to mean that you have to doubt everything until you come to the rock bottom truth. So how do you interpret that vis-a-vis faith if you're doubting everything?
So what do you have? I guess the first question is, what is it that you have faith in?
Well, I guess you have to have faith in order to do it in the first place, that you're going to get some, or at least have a working hypothesis. As I think it was Gita Prana or someone who said to have a working hypothesis. So I guess I answered my own question.
There you go. Self-knowledge, that's what it's all about, right? Okay, very good. Anybody else want to add something? Yes, Prit?
Yeah, you mentioned yoga for Deepika, right? Who was the author of that? Part of Raja Yoga, that's it. Hatha Yoga.
The Hatha Yoga Pradipika, yeah, it's I know I'm going to trip up on the pronunciation, but just bear with me. It's Sva, H-V-A, Svatman. It's there, but it's not coming. It's something like Svat. Do you know Vishwanath? Yeah. Yeah, it's a. Yes, yeah.
That's from Giranda Samhita?
Giranda's, that's a different text that also explains it, but the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, basically it starts out as saying at the very beginning of it, it says people don't understand the Raja Yoga. So this kind author of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika is going to go step by step explaining what Raja Yoga is, because there are multiple opinions of what it is. So that's how the opening verse of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika starts. And they give his name, and yeah.
I'm just looking up Wikipedia.
Okay.
Swami Svatmaram, who connects the teachings lineage to Matsyendranath.
Yeah, so yes. So,
It's a 15th century Sanskrit manual on Hatha Yoga.
yep, so that is the author, right? So I remember S-V-A-T-M. Yeah. And then he gives his whole lineage there of all of the other yogis. But, yes, it's also, I think there are many PDF versions, and some other societies have published. Okay, yes.
Patanjali's yoga sutras, do they sort of stand on their own? I mean, are they to understand them, is there some earlier works, or they pretty much, they stand on their own, but they're not a commentary on anything? Or?
No, they're the essence. They're recognized as sort of the recognized essence of the yoga practices. And we'll see in the next Friday, we're going to go through the first 6 verses. But they're concise. But they tell, well, I could tell the second verse now, but we're kind of taking time from next week. But if you look, I mean, this one is considered the definition of yoga, period. It says, Yoga Chitta Vitri Nirodha. It says, yoga is the stilling of the whirlpools of the mind. That right there is the very definition of it. If you understand that and you can do it, you're done. You don't need the rest of the book, right? That's the definition of yoga. But the rest of them explain what it takes along the way, what the obstacles are along the way, and all of that. And that's part of we're going to dive into these sutra by sutra next Friday. And each one has a lot of commentary. Swami Vivekananda did a lot of commentary, which I'll borrow from. And then I'll do some of my musings like I usually do in between as well. So that's a full Friday, next Friday, just on 6. It's about 12 minutes each, roughly. Okay, okay. All right, so if there are no other questions, did you have something, Vishwanath? No? Okay. So we will do the standard closing prayer. Can you switch to the clip? Okay, all right, very good. May the Divine, who is Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Great Spirit of the Native Americans, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the all-loving being manifest unto us and grant us abiding understanding and all-consuming divine love. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.